New York's logistics costs didn't explode by accident. They rose because a set of structural pressures collided with political decisions, and the bill is now being handed to businesses and households across the state. That's why the governor is under pressure. Not because of a headline, but because the mechanisms underneath are now visible, measurable, and painful. Start with the basics. Logistics means the movement and storage of goods. Trucking, rail, ports, warehouses, fuel, labor, insurance, inventory carrying costs. When those costs rise, nothing stays cheap. Food, building materials, medical supplies, retail goods, all of it moves through this system. New York is especially exposed because it's dense, import-heavy, and dependent on constant inflows to keep daily life functioning. When friction increases, prices move fast. Nationally, logistics costs have been climbing again after the brief post-pandemic dip. Higher interest rates increase inventory carrying costs. Labor remains expensive, especially for drivers, warehouse workers, and port operations. Insurance costs are up. Fuel prices are volatile. Those are background pressures every state faces, but New York adds its own layers on top. The most immediate flashpoint is congestion pricing in New York City. For the state, this is framed as traffic management and transit funding. For logistics operators, it functions as a new recurring cost on every truck entering Manhattan's core. Delivery companies don't have the option to work from home. Food distributors, construction suppliers, medical logistics firms, they cross that zone daily. Each crossing is now a toll, and those tolls compound over a year into six-figure costs for mid-sized operators. Here's the mechanism. Logistics firms operate on thin margins. They don't absorb new fees, they pass them forward. Wholesalers charge retailers more. Retailers charge consumers more. Or, if they can't pass it on fully, they cut routes, reduce service frequency, or exit the market. That's not ideology, that's arithmetic. The governor's office argues congestion pricing reduces traffic and improves efficiency. That may be true in a narrow sense, but even if traffic flows improve, the toll is still a toll. Efficiency gains don't cancel fixed charges. The policy redistributes costs. Transit riders and the state's capital plan benefit. Freight-dependent businesses pay. That redistribution is the political fight now landing at the governor's desk. At the same time, New York businesses are dealing with federal-level cost pressures that the state doesn't control but must absorb. Tariffs on imported inputs function like a tax on logistics chains. Steel, aluminum, machinery, packaging, agricultural inputs, higher input costs ripple through warehousing, transport, and final pricing. The state government itself has acknowledged this in reports highlighting how tariffs raise costs for New York households and firms. But acknowledgement doesn't eliminate the pressure, it just explains it. Energy costs are another pressure point. Warehouses, cold storage, distribution centers, and electrified fleets all depend on stable, affordable power. New York's grid is under strain from rising demand and slow infrastructure expansion. When electricity prices rise, logistics costs rise with them. Again, these aren't abstract climate debates. They show up as higher per-unit costs in distribution contracts. Put this together and you see why the phrase logistics costs exploding resonates politically. Businesses feel squeezed from every side: tolls, energy, labor, insurance, tariffs. Consumers feel it when grocery bills rise and delivery fees creep upward. And the governor sits in the middle, defending policies designed to fund infrastructure and manage congestion, while facing the reality that those same policies impose real, immediate costs on economic circulation. This is the tension. New York needs revenue for transit and infrastructure. It also needs goods to move cheaply and reliably. When you fund the former by taxing the latter, conflict is guaranteed. The pressure on the governor isn't just partisan noise. It's the sound of a cost structure shifting, and people asking who decided this was the way to do it. And that leads directly to the next question: how congestion pricing specifically became the symbol of this broader logistics cost fight, and why its design matters more than its stated intentions. Congestion pricing didn't become controversial because people don't understand traffic. It became controversial because of how the costs are structured, who pays them, and who doesn't. This is where the abstract language of efficiency collides with the concrete realities of logistics. Mechanically, congestion pricing is simple. Vehicles entering a designated zone in Manhattan are charged a fee. The state's justification is equally simple: fewer cars, less congestion, lower emissions, and a dedicated revenue stream for mass transit. On paper, it looks tidy. Economists like price signals, urban planners like demand management, transit agencies like guaranteed money. But logistics doesn't live on paper. It lives on schedules, margins, and contractual obligations. For a trucking or delivery firm, congestion pricing is not a behavioral nudge. It's a fixed operating cost. A grocery distributor doesn't get to choose whether food enters Manhattan. Hospitals don't receive supplies on bicycles. Construction sites don't get steel by subway. These trips are mandatory, repetitive, and time-sensitive. That's the key distinction policymakers often gloss over. Private commuters might change behavior. Logistics firms cannot. That means the toll is not discouraging unnecessary trips, it's taxing necessary ones. And once you understand that, the backlash makes sense. When industry groups say congestion pricing will raise costs by hundreds of thousands of dollars per year for mid-sized distributors, they're not exaggerating. They're multiplying a daily toll by hundreds of annual entries. The math is brutal and unavoidable. Now follow the money. The revenue from congestion pricing is earmarked primarily for transit capital improvements. Subways, buses, long-term infrastructure projects. Those investments may be socially valuable, but the funding model matters. You are financing public infrastructure by increasing the cost of private goods movement. That's a transfer. Someone wins, someone pays. Who wins? Transit agencies, construction contractors, bondholders tied to capital projects, and riders who may see system improvements over time. Who pays? Freight carriers, wholesalers, small retailers, and ultimately consumers, especially in food, building materials, and healthcare-related goods. These are sectors with low margins and limited pricing power. That's why they're loud. They're not ideologically opposed to transit. They're reacting to survival math. The governor's defense is that congestion pricing reduces traffic, which lowers delivery times and offsets some of the cost. This is where theory meets reality. Reduced congestion helps, but it doesn't eliminate tolls. A faster trip that costs more is still more expensive if the toll outweighs the time savings. And for many logistics operations, labor and routing efficiencies were already optimized long before congestion pricing arrived. There wasn't much slack left to squeeze. There's also a geographic spillover effect. Deliveries don't stop at the congestion zone boundary. Costs incurred in Manhattan ripple outward. Prices rise in outer boroughs and suburbs because suppliers equalize pricing across regions. In other words, a Manhattan toll becomes a statewide cost pressure. That's why this isn't just a New York City issue, it's a New York State issue. Add federal intervention into the mix, and the politics get sharper. When federal officials threaten funding or challenge the legality of the program, uncertainty itself becomes a cost. Logistics firms hate uncertainty. They plan routes, fleets, and contracts years ahead. If a major toll regime might be altered, suspended, or expanded depending on court rulings or elections, firms hedge by raising prices or delaying investment. Again, costs rise before anything happens. So congestion pricing becomes more than a traffic policy. It becomes a symbol. To supporters, it's long overdue pricing of scarce urban space. To critics, it's a tax on commerce disguised as environmental policy. And to the governor, it's a high-stakes bet. Defend it and risk alienating business and cost-sensitive voters, or weaken it and risk losing transit funding and political credibility. This is why logistics costs are central to the controversy, not because congestion pricing exists, but because of who bears its burden. And once you see that burden clearly, the next layer comes into focus: how federal trade and tariff policies stack on top of state-level costs, turning a squeeze into a vice. If congestion pricing is the most visible cost, tariffs are the quieter one, and in many ways more damaging. They don't show up as a line item called tariff tax on a receipt, but they work the same way. They raise the cost of inputs moving through the supply chain, and by the time those goods reach New York consumers, the price increase is already baked in. This is where state-level logistics stress collides with federal policy choices. Tariffs operate upstream. They hit raw materials, intermediate goods, machinery, packaging, and food inputs before a truck ever rolls into New York. Steel for construction, aluminum for manufacturing, fertilizers and equipment for agriculture, auto parts, electronics components. All of these move through tariff-affected channels. When the federal government imposes or maintains tariffs, importers pay more. That higher cost then flows through distributors, warehouses, and transport firms. Logistics doesn't create the inflation here. It transmits it. New York is especially exposed because of its trade profile. The state is deeply integrated into international supply chains, particularly with Canada and Europe. It imports large volumes of construction materials, energy-related equipment, food products, and manufactured goods. It also exports heavily. Tariffs disrupt both directions, raising input costs on the way in and provoking retaliatory barriers on the way out. That means higher logistics costs per unit and lower volumes over which to spread fixed expenses. Again, basic economics. Governor Hochul's administration has tried to make this visible by commissioning and publicizing tariff impact reports. These reports frame tariffs as a de facto tax on New York families and businesses, estimating thousands of dollars per household in higher annual costs. The political message is clear. Don't blame Albany for everything. Washington has its hand on the scale too. But politically, this is risky. Voters don't experience federal trade policy. They experience higher prices. For logistics firms, tariffs are a double hit. First, they raise the value of goods being moved, which increases insurance costs and working capital requirements. Second, they reduce demand. When imported goods cost more, some buyers pull back. Lower volumes mean trucks and warehouses operate below capacity, pushing per-unit costs higher. That's how inflation can coexist with weakening demand, a dynamic many logistics operators now face. Manufacturers feel this acutely. New York manufacturers relying on imported inputs see their costs rise, while foreign competitors may not face the same burden. Some firms absorb the hit temporarily, others pass it on. Some cut jobs or delay investment. Each response feeds back into logistics. Fewer shipments, more expensive shipments, or more fragmented supply chains all raise system-wide costs. Agriculture and food distribution are another pressure point. Tariffs on equipment, packaging, and certain food categories raise costs long before products reach grocery shelves. For a state with millions of residents dependent on daily food inflows, even small percentage increases compound quickly. This is why food prices are politically explosive. Logistics is invisible until food gets expensive. From the governor's perspective, tariffs create a political trap. She can criticize them, but she can't remove them. She can document their effects, but documentation doesn't lower prices. Meanwhile, state policies like congestion pricing are visible and controllable, so they attract disproportionate blame. The public doesn't separate layers of governance when costs rise. They look at who's closest. This stacking effect matters. Congestion tolls raise the cost of moving goods inside the state. Tariffs raise the cost of goods entering the state. Energy and labor costs raise the cost of storing and handling those goods. None of these operate in isolation. Together, they create a compounding squeeze on logistics operators that feels sudden, even if each policy arrived gradually. And that's the key transition to the next part. Once you move past individual policies, you see that even without new tolls or tariffs, logistics costs were already under pressure from deeper structural forces: labor, infrastructure, energy, and financing, forces that make every added policy cost feel heavier than policymakers expect. Even if congestion pricing vanished tomorrow and tariffs were rolled back, New York's logistics costs would not suddenly fall back to some comfortable baseline. That's because a large share of the pressure is structural. These are costs baked into how the system now operates, not temporary policy shocks. Ignoring them leads to bad political analysis and worse policy decisions. Start with labor. Logistics is labor-intensive, and the labor market has changed. Truck drivers, warehouse workers, mechanics, port staff. These jobs are harder to fill and more expensive to staff than they were a decade ago. Wages are higher, overtime is more common, and turnover is costly. For firms operating around the clock, labor is not a marginal expense, it's a core one. Higher labor costs raise the floor for everything else. Then there's infrastructure. New York's freight infrastructure is old, fragmented, and often congested, even without formal pricing schemes. Roads, bridges, rail connections, and port facilities require constant maintenance and periodic overhaul. When infrastructure lags, logistics firms pay in time, fuel, and equipment wear. Delays aren't just inconvenient, they're expensive. A truck sitting in traffic still burns fuel, still occupies a driver's hours, and still misses its next delivery window. Warehousing is another quiet cost driver. The rise of just-in-time logistics was reversed by pandemic shocks, pushing firms to hold more inventory as a hedge against disruption. Higher interest rates make that inventory more expensive to carry. Warehouses require land, power, security, and labor. In New York, land and electricity are particularly expensive. As e-commerce and same-day delivery expectations persist, demand for urban and near-urban warehouse space remains high, keeping rents elevated. Energy deserves special attention. Logistics runs on energy: diesel, electricity, natural gas. Volatility in fuel markets makes cost planning difficult. Electrification, while promising long-term savings and environmental benefits, requires upfront capital and grid capacity. Distribution centers with refrigeration, data systems, and automation are energy hungry. When power costs rise or grid constraints appear, logistics firms face higher operating expenses and new investment requirements just to maintain service levels. Financing costs are the final piece. Trucks, warehouses, refrigeration systems, and port equipment are capital-intensive assets. Higher interest rates raise the cost of replacing fleets and upgrading facilities. Smaller operators are hit hardest because they lack cheap credit. When financing tightens, consolidation accelerates. Larger firms survive, smaller ones exit. That reduces competition and can raise prices further. Another feedback loop. This is why focusing only on headline policies misses the bigger picture. The logistics system is under strain from multiple directions at once. Policy costs don't land on a stable base. They land on an already stressed structure. That's why the reaction feels disproportionate. Businesses aren't just complaining about one new fee. They're reacting to cumulative pressure that finally crosses a threshold. For the governor, this creates a governing dilemma. Structural cost drivers are slow to fix and politically unrewarding. Infrastructure takes years. Labor shortages don't resolve with press conferences. Energy systems require massive coordination and investment. But political accountability is immediate. Voters don't wait for long-term benefits. They respond to short-term price increases. Understanding these structural forces is essential because they explain why every additional cost, a toll, a tariff, a regulatory requirement, generates outsized backlash. The system has less slack than policymakers assume, and that sets up the final question. In this environment, who ultimately wins, who loses, and how much political risk the governor is willing to absorb to keep the current model in place. When logistics costs rise across an entire state, the outcome is not neutral. Someone pays, someone benefits, and someone gets blamed. That's the political economy reality Governor Hochul is now navigating, whether she acknowledges it openly or not. Start with the winners. Congestion pricing generates a dedicated revenue stream for mass transit. That money supports capital projects, debt service, and long-term system upgrades. Construction firms, engineering contractors, and financial institutions tied to transit financing benefit directly. Transit riders may benefit indirectly if projects are completed on time and service improves. Environmental advocates also gain policy wins aligned with emissions reduction goals. These groups are organized, vocal, and politically influential, especially within the state's governing coalition. Now the losers. Logistics firms, wholesalers, distributors, and small retailers absorb immediate cost increases. These businesses don't issue press releases about climate targets. They issue invoices. Their political power is diffuse. They're spread across industries and regions, often too fragmented to coordinate effectively. When they do organize, they're portrayed as defending narrow interests, even though they move essential goods. Consumers sit downstream from all of this. They don't see toll invoices or tariff schedules. They see higher grocery bills, delivery surcharges, rising rents tied to construction costs, and more expensive repairs. Inflation becomes personal long before it becomes ideological, and voters don't carefully allocate blame between federal and state policy. They punish whoever is in charge locally when prices feel out of control. That's where the political risk concentrates. The governor can explain congestion pricing, she can publish tariff impact reports, she can point to long-term infrastructure needs, but explanation does not equal relief. In an affordability crisis, voters care less about rationale and more about results. If the cost of living continues to rise, policy intent becomes irrelevant. There's also a longer-term structural risk, business exit. If logistics and distribution firms conclude that operating in New York is structurally more expensive than neighboring states, investment shifts, warehouses move, routes change, jobs follow. These decisions don't make headlines at first. They show up years later as lost tax base and reduced economic resilience. By then, the political actors who made the original decisions may be gone, but the consequences remain. For Hochul, the dilemma is not simply whether congestion pricing is good policy. It's whether the state's cost burden is being allocated in a way that's politically sustainable. Funding infrastructure by taxing goods movement works until it doesn't, until enough businesses and households feel squeezed at the same time. At that point, resistance hardens and compromise becomes unavoidable. The deeper issue is structural. New York relies on constant inflows of goods, energy, labor, and capital. When policies increase friction in those flows without reducing underlying costs elsewhere, prices rise. If the state wants both world-class infrastructure and affordable living, it must confront who pays for what and why. Shifting costs onto logistics is easy, absorbing them politically is not. That's why the pressure on the governor is real and growing. Not because of one policy, one toll, or one report, but because the system is revealing its trade-offs. And once those trade-offs are visible to voters, they don't disappear. They demand answers.